Hey,
Hello,
good
everyone, and
afternoon.
thank you. Hey, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today entitled Mission Possible, Achieving Continuous Delivery ROI in 30 Days. My name is Richard White, and I'm the Managing Director for Orasi, heading up our IT delivery and DevOps practice. I'm also excited to have Ravi Lockman from Harness joining me today. Orasi recently announced a strategic partnership with Harness back in February of this year to resell and deliver solutions with Harness, and this is one of our initial ventures together. So, Ravi, if you wouldn't mind, just take a moment and introduce yourself and your role.
Yeah, absolutely. Ravi Lockman. I'm an evangelist at Harness. I help marry people in software. I'm very excited today to be talking with Orasi and the crowd and the webinar today. So excited.
Thank you, Ravi. So before we get started into the discussion about continuous delivery, I've got just one slide, about 60 seconds or less, to really simply position how Orasi goes to market, supporting DevOps opportunities. So one thing is we partner with a lot of the best-of-breed tools in the DevOps space, tools like Harness, Dynatrace, the HashiCorp suite of products like Terraform and Vault and others. And so we resell those products, but we also provide services to help our clients to achieve business solutions around those tools, to really help them sort of knit together the best processes to work with the tools, to make sure that people have the right skill sets, that they have their organization aligned, and they're really prepared to deal with the sort of the cultural challenges that come with DevOps. And so what you see here on the screen is that we break our services into three basic areas. There's strategy, delivery, and managed services. And so what we find is that from client to client, everybody has a similar pattern potentially in the DevOps world, but where they are on their journey and the specific challenges they have in front of them, whether they're trying to adopt a new technology, et cetera, and add it into their pipeline, most people are at very different points, even at different points within their own pipelines or within the same company. And our sort of GPS service around DevOps is really focused on helping customers understand where they are today and then where they want to go in the future and coming up with a plan for helping them get there. And so today, as I talk with Ravi about continuous delivery, I'll focus most of my comments around how we can help you from a strategy perspective. And then Ravi will obviously be diving into the continuous delivery parts deeper. So to get started, I'll pitch it over to Ravi to let him sort of set the stage on where CD is in today's market. Go ahead, Ravi.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So let's take a little bit of jog down memory lane. So what I'm going to be doing, I'll be kind of like laying out the difference between CI and CD. But let's talk about where all of this demand came from. So a little bit about me. Most of my career, I've been a Java developer, so writing J2E stuff. So back in the day when I was coming out of university, my work product would be some sort of binary distribution, like a war, and basically writing some Java, maybe some JMS. And I would typically be heading to one of three target platforms. You know, I would be heading to IBM WebSphere, Oracle WebLogic, or most of the time I'd be heading to JBoss. Now, that's pretty easy. My main job function was to build a binary distribution, so it could be a war, a jar, or an ear. And we actually know what the target distribution would be when it will be deploying to. Now, if we fast forward to today, I'm the same person, a little bit older, maybe a little bit grayer and bigger in size, but the amount of share that I have to deal with as a software engineer is actually a lot. Now, even dealing with share in the Java language, you know, we're dealing with JavaScript. I'm also dealing with a lot of third-party open source and kind of going left to right. Not only is building something kind of par for the course, I have to automate the build. I'm using things like Jenkins. I'm using infrastructure as code to make sure it's consistent. And then I have to worry about the packaging format, right? So am I putting it in a Mesos container or a Docker container? Am I going to JBoss still? Do I use Tomcat? And not only is that it, I have to worry about orchestration. So, okay, we're going to go to Kubernetes, but now I need to make sure that we're able to consistently deploy something. So I'm using something like Helm or Kustomize. Then I have to pick a logging framework like Statsy or Fluentd. And then on top of all that complexity, I'm going to have to look at which public cloud provider to go to. You know, are we using GCP? Are we using AWS? And I'm the same person, right? And which makes it so difficult that each one of these technologies have pros and cons. Each one of these technologies have operational difficulties. And it's really, really difficult as a software engineer to kind of make all these choices. So this is where continuous delivery is going to step in for us. It's going to be helping us automate the decisions that we need to successfully deploy. But before we get started, let's go ahead and talk about what continuous integration is. So CI. So a lot of times you'll hear somebody saying like, hey, we live in the Southeast, so I say Coca-Cola for any type of soda or Kleenex for any type of tissue. Well, that type of FNM, people say CI/CD all in one blurt. So my definition of continuous integration is what you see on the screen here. So here I have some Spring Boot code. And CI is all about automating the build and producing a binary artifact, right? So taking source code that we as humans understand and getting that to a binary distribution that the machine understands. So I might be making a Docker image, a Mesos container. It's hard usually, or the Java distributions I worked on before, but that is the sole purpose of continuous integration. So let's take a look at actually what a typical software development pipeline looks like. And so here we're going to be going from idea to production. So the first step is here is your build step, right? So this is pretty big by most firms. You're using some sort of build automation tool, and you know how to build a software or put the software together that you've written, right? So it's coming from maybe an artifact repository, you might be using a build tool like Jenkins or Bamboo. And then also when we kind of move forward, that's actually pretty automated. But kind of the next step is, well, we have to test. There's certainly tests that are baked in before you create the binary artifact, but now we're stepping into more of integration tests, right? So again, you might be using Jenkins to orchestrate. You might be using tools like Selenium or load testing tools. And then kind of the next step is, once you pass those confidence building steps, is actually to do the deployment. Now, no matter where I've worked, I must have been on dozens of software projects and teams in my career span and academic span. No matter what you do, it seems like when we go to deploy, I've always deployed differently, every project to every project. As a lot of standardization happened in the build section, a lot of standardization happened in languages and approaches. Ironically, no standardization happened in deployment because everybody deploys differently. And typically, this is a lot of scripts that you have to deal with. Kind of crossing over the chasm there between the customer. Now, once you have something deployed, this is where it gets a little bit difficult, right? So you have to validate or verify what you actually have done. I previously used to work for a bank or an investment bank as an application or a dev manager. I was an application owner. And so one of the most queasy feelings I always had, even though we would build every day, we would release only once a month unless there was an emergency. And we always had a very hard and subjective way of understanding that what we deployed was correct, right? But there's a whole bunch of tools you can look at. There's APM tools like AppDynamics or New Relic. There's log aggregation tools like Splunk. Even there's other ways you might grep or tail the logs to make sure things are going right. And then lastly, one of the most subjective things that's out there is a rollback, which is ironic. We deal in systems. And usually I like to ask people, when I talk face-to-face with them, is like, hey, when do you roll back? And we'd love to hear from the audience, and if you post it up as a question, when do you actually roll back? And ironically, as when dealing with systems, we usually deal pretty objectively, but a rollback could be very subjective. At working at the bank, I was bonus and MBO, so managed the business objectives, but I had to get my features out into production. There's a lot of, even though we might be saying that, it looks okay, it kind of looks okay, I would really push to make sure we roll forward because I want to make sure my bonus payment gets there, which is the irony of being subjective to a rollback. But if we take a look at the amount of time this actually takes, building, it's pretty quick, right? But when we start getting it close to the customer, what we typically see and what might be my experience, our deployments can take hours or days. And then depending on how far back from the judgment call you actually are, your rollback can take hours. And this is what is fairly difficult, and I can kind of show that in the Harness platform a little bit later, makes it a little bit more streamlined. So taking a look at what I would define as continuous delivery or CD, it's basically we want to automate everything. So going back to decisioning yays or nays, one of the I would say the hardest parts to get right in continuous delivery is you have two radio dials. You have the radio dials of innovation, and you have the radio dials of business controls on one side. So kind of fine-tuning those radio dials can get a little bit difficult. And so if you take a look at these three particular stages here, going back to from stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, it's what I like to call a tightening the rope or tightening the screw type of model. is that you want to make sure you allow your development teams to have innovation. So you don't want to be too stringent on them, but as you get closer to the customer or as you get closer to your end users, you want to make sure that the amount of rigor you have in your test cases apply. And this is typically going from unit test to integration test, and taking a look left to right. So kind of your stage one, pretty easy to automate, right? In your build process, you might have static code analysis, you might do unit tests. But as you kind of leave the dev environments and dev integration go into QA, this is where you start taking in environmental concerns. You're taking in environmental concerns such as your smoke test or SOAP test. You're doing regression tests. You're now doing perf tests, maybe chaos engineering if you're looking at some of the new ways of testing things. And then by the time you get to production, now it gets to be really tricky because you might have a system that you can't afford any downtime on. So this is when you have to decide on your release strategy. So you might be doing a canary release. You might be doing certain types of verification, such as additional availability tests or perf tests, again, on production. You might be doing consistent assessment of security threats against your production environment, so the tests actually never stop, the battery of tests. And so this is basically continuous delivery in a nutshell, right? All of your confidence building steps kind of orchestrated. And so what does it mean to have confidence building steps? And so it's something I like to call the confidence trifecta. So if you follow any sort of DevOps moniker, so the people, process, technology, you would have heard these particular 3 points before. But in confidence, this is the argument I always like to give. The entire reason for the SDLC, or the entire reason why you have a change control process, is that you're building confidence. And so in technology and process, I think it's fairly easy to build confidence. So in technology, let's say you're using a platform like Kubernetes or using another distributed system. Well, you might say, you know what? I have 5 nodes. I can take 2 concurrent failures in my technology space, or even I have a hot DR, right? So you are fairly confident in your technology stack to handle failure, to be resilient. Process-wise, similar also. Yes, we have a change control board I have to go through. There's change control process that I have to go through. We have a whole battery of tests that we have to go through. Fairly, kind of systemic to build process confidence. But where it's more objective is us as people, right? So the whole rationale behind why we're driving technology confidence or process confidence is that the people behind it are be confident. As people, we're emotional. As people, we have, we're some total of our experiences. So if let's say the presenters on this call are presented with a problem, most likely Richard and I would have 2 different solutions because we have 2 different backgrounds. With that, right, like the hardest part is to build confidence in people. And that's ironically what continuous delivery tries to help achieve also, is that, hey, your change control board, hey, be as comfortable as you want. We can automate as little or as much of that as possible. But with that explanation of confidence, I want to pass it back over to Richard to kind of talk about helping you understand where you are today. Richard?
Yep, thanks, Ravi. Go ahead and click and move forward here. Try it again. Let's see. There we go. So Ravi's talked a lot about the continuous delivery world and how it's matured and what some of the complexities that exist are, and how some of the solutions are coming to help the dev teams and the ops teams actually start to deliver on this. So I just wanted to take just a moment to talk about having a strategy for your DevOps approach. Now, we obviously do a lot of work in the delivery world, actually helping deliver tools like Harness and the other ones. We also offer managed service solutions, but specifically around strategy, what we find is that majority of the companies out there in the world, a lot of people just sort of morph their approach. They sort of evolve. They used to do it this way, and they really don't think about it as much as they like to just jump in and go. And so the challenge is that the capabilities to deliver things like continuous delivery, or if you're just trying to implement containers or continuous testing inside of your DevOps process, the capabilities are just changing dramatically overnight. And so the question we always try to ask is, wouldn't it make sense just to stop for a short moment and start to really proactively start to design the way that you want this to go forward based on where you are today instead of just evolving? And so, the best way I can give you as an example for what is strategy, I always hear people say strategy, we need a strategy, et cetera, but I'm not sure they always understand exactly what it is. So if I gave you an old school example, you see on the map there just a Waze map, and it says basically, 15 years ago, if I were going from my house today to Athens, Georgia, to the University of Georgia to go watch a football game, which that's what we do here in Georgia, the first thing I'd have to do is actually get out a map and figure out where I am on that map and understand what are my available options for getting there, and then choose the best path for how I should get there. And then, the challenge is that about 100,000 other people would be doing the same thing. And so based on what they're doing, it may change my perspective on the best way to get there and what's the best pattern. And so in today's world, I have, this simple thing called a GPS on my phone, and I put that information in, and it offers me the options, and it recommends the best plan for me to move forward. And in some ways, that's kind of what a technology strategy should do. It should tell you, based on where you are, what's the best way for your organization to move forward. And when I talk about that, one of the things that comes out of a strategy is a set of recommendations that should be prioritized. You should understand the level of effort it would take to implement them, and should be prioritized based on your needs. And so as a part of those recommendations, I will tell you that it's generally very good that for each of those recommendations that you actually come up with a set of, well, how did we come to those recommendations? What were the options we considered? What decisions did we make? How do we justify those decisions? Do we understand the impact of those decisions? And so that's the real value in a strategy, is to say, here is where I should go, and here's why I made that choice. But then we should also take and turn those recommendations into some level of a roadmap that says, if I were you, I would do these things in this order because we're going to get the biggest bang for the buck out of those type things. And in reality, typically, we should build very detailed plans that support this high-level roadmap, and even probably have some short-term POV or proof of concept that allows us to take a lot of these core concepts and prove them. And the last thing I would say is we really want to make sure that as we deliver these recommendations and this roadmap, that we're prepared to justify to our executive leadership what the benefit that we're going to get out of these investments are. And the last thing I'd sort of say about it is, as we've done a lot of different strategies, one of the things in the DevOps world we have to consider is, are you looking to do, as we talk to people, one of the things we have to do is narrow that scope and say, are you wanting to look at the full pipe from source code check-in, continuous integration through deployment into production? Are you just interested in a strategy around a piece of that pipe, like, hey, I'm trying to implement containers in my pipeline, or I'm trying to implement monitoring into my pipeline, or continuous delivery into my pipeline? Or am I looking at multiple pipelines? I have 4 or 5 of them for different technology stacks, and I'm looking for consistency. And one of the ways, the way our approach to moving forward with this is to really start to take and look and say, well, what is your process for moving today? So, instead of just going to the grocery store and buying what you feel hungry for, you should probably look in the refrigerator and see, what do we have there, so that we can determine what we actually need when we get to the grocery store. So by looking at things about where you are today, like what is your process for getting things to production? How does the people interact in that process? What technologies overlay that process? And then what are some of the cultural challenges and metrics that are being used to deliver that? Ultimately, that allows us to get to what I see as the core, which is, hey, we're trying to make improvements on these specific things. This priority, this priority, this priority. These are the things that we need to change to improve the way we deliver software. And then we actually take those, and you see at the top there, we're taking that set of priorities, and then we're mashing those with our sort of industry best practices. Our consultants have done this multiple times for clients, and so it's not our opinion. We're not going to just tell you what to do. We would like to talk to you about, here are the options available for you, and here are the pros and cons of that. Which one do you think would allow you to achieve what you want? And let's actually get that documented and go forward, and let's be prepared to justify it. So from our standpoint, that's sort of what leads, that's what a strategy is, and that's kind of a high-level approach to how we would go about achieving that. And that can be done in a really short time, depending on how broad the scope of your view of your effort is. So I'm going to pass it back to Ravi to talk to us a little bit about moving that forward in a continuous delivery model.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Richard. So, let's kind of change gears a little bit here. You know, we did talk a lot about kind of like to be and as is type of architecture, but let's look at another industry that I think it's very interesting. There's a lot of duality you can kind of tie to, you know, kind of modern day software delivery. So, who here remembers applying for a credit card in the 1990s? I'll date myself. You know, I got my first credit card in the late 90s. And if you remember what that experience looks like, I'll pretend we're calling American Express. So I would call American Express. I would talk to a customer service representative. You know, he or she would ask me some prudent questions. Hi, I'm Ravi. You know, what's your social? How much money you make? And then in the 2 weeks after that, you know, so this is 2 weeks later, I'll get a piece of mail in my mailbox saying if I got approved or declined. And then 2 weeks after that, so that's four total weeks, I would get the credit card that I applied for. Now that 4 total weeks, you know, seems normal, right? But if you take a look at today, you know, here's one of my favorite people. Here's Ryan Kelly, the points guy, and so if the amount of time it took me to just explain me calling somebody and like just the 40 or 50 seconds it took me to explain that process, you could have went into your American Express app, apply for a new card, and have a temporary or your actual card number in your Apple Wallet, right? And that's kind of the consumer experience we have in 2020. Now, if let's say the credit card, I'll go back a slide. So like if the credit card company that you're looking at today, you know, was like Skeletor or Mr. Skeleton over here, they would be out of business. Let's asinine that something will take 4 weeks to get an approval and you'll be able to use it. But here's where the irony comes in. You know, in enterprise IT, going back to I only release once a month, like, why is this okay in enterprise IT? You know, our consumer expectation is instantaneous, and it's not like the amount of decisions that American Express had to, you know, process about you went down. If anything, the amount of decision criteria they have actually went up. But they're able to process the risk and process that for you instantaneously. And that's a big goal of continuous delivery. And so let's get into some of the fun stuff. So continuous delivery as a service, right? So you might be thinking in the back of your head, oh, well, Ravi, you know, the amount of automation that it requires actually might be a little bit too much of a burden for my enterprise or my team, which, you know, hey, you know your team the best, that you know your risk tolerance, your organization the best, but let's think of it like this. You know, Harness, we have something called a continuous delivery as a service. And so CDAS, CDAS, this is one of those, you know, asterisk AAS things. But if we consider what continuous delivery as a service means, is that we're really orchestrating a few pillars for you in an automated fashion. And I'll actually get into what this actually looks like in a product demo. But you're orchestrating your releases, right? So we're helping you orchestrate, or a CD as a service platform is helping you orchestrate your releases. You might be doing a canary release. You might be doing a blue-green. You might be doing a rolling deployment. Hey, it's really helping you automate your release strategy. And then kind of like the two other pieces that like I would say pillars that a continuous delivery as a service platform offers is all those confidence building steps, right? Those hundreds of decisions or yay or nay judgment calls that you have to get. Also the approvals and such, right? So you're building confidence, you're automating the approvals at certain thresholds. So basically you're becoming like the credit card provider of today. You're saying, hey, you know what, this application doesn't look very risky. Let's go ahead and promote it in a safe manner to production. So that in a nutshell is what a CD as a service solution is. I'm going to pass it back to Richard here to talk about how do you actually measure success in a DevOps fashion.
I probably should take myself off mute there, Ravi. So I think everybody's probably familiar with the state of DevOps, and they do a significant research on where the maturity of organizations are aligned to a DevOps concept. And what they do is they really show that the top 20% of the organizations in the world are doing things much faster, and they're doing it with more quality. As a matter of fact, there's 4 key metrics that they talk about, and you see down at the bottom, And that is, one of them is that the top 20 organizations in the world, they are able to actually deploy 208 times faster than a typical organization. So they're going through and actually being able to deploy over and over and over continuously because they have their pipelines codified and that they're following a consistent process. And the crazy thing is that as they're going through that so many more times in a normal organization, they're going from beginning of the pipeline to the end over 100 times faster than the typical organization. And while they do it, they're actually able to recover from any failure over 2,600 times faster. So as you saw, Ravi was talking about what's your rollback approach. You know, most people are most developers, they're thinking about just getting it out the door as opposed to how do you handle those operational things when things don't follow the happy path and go as you expect. And so when the failures do occur, they're able to roll back so much faster. And crazy, even though they're running at 200 times the speed, they're getting 7 times better quality coming out. And it's because this process isn't something new, it's not creative, it becomes something that they do hundreds of times a day or a week or a month. And so now these 4 metrics obviously can blow down to a lot more detail. You know, for each one of those, other metrics can help you determine where you are, et cetera. But at the end of the day, these are like the 4 core metrics. And it's one of the great things is a lot of this is built into a tool like a Harness. So I'll pass it back to you, Ravi, to talk about where that might be.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Richard. So one of the hardest things to do, so those metrics that Richard was talking about, you know, they come from this book by Dora, or aka the book's called Accelerate. And basically with these particular Accelerate metrics, right, looking at lead time, change failure rate, MTTR, which is mean time to restore, and deployment frequency, those are actually very hard metrics to actually ascertain, right? Like it has to be at an organizational level. You know, it's sometimes you might be, you know, if there's a lot of iteration in software development, right? Like, hey, you know what, we have to keep deploying to get something right, or we have to keep building, deploying to get, you know, to the end feature that we want. And a lot of times when you're looking at how do you actually measure, you know, effectiveness as a team, there's some really good and bad metrics out there, like GitHub commits. You know, the more green squares I have, am I doing a better job as an engineer? Well, maybe not, right? Like, you know, you can't be, you know, showing activity as the only metric of success. And so with the Dora folks, you know, they really came up with these 4 crucial metrics, how to measure effectiveness on a team. And that's something that at Harness we actually keep track of pretty easily. Now it's time for a little bit of a Harness demo. Let me actually switch into the Harness product and show everybody the magic of the Harness platform. And so I actually have the Harness platform up and running here. The first thing you notice that, you know, we can kind of keep track of all of our deployments. So there's a lot of deployments going on in our environment here. We're able to break down our deployments via service and by cloud providers. So knowing where your deployments go sometimes can be a problem, especially in this multi-cloud, hybrid cloud world. You know, we're looking at the best possible infrastructure at a point in time to run our solutions. You know, a lot of folks are embracing the hybrid cloud. But let's actually go ahead and actually deploy something. So if you go into continuous deployment and I want to start a new deployment, I'm going to deploy the demo application, our illustrious demo application. I'm going to be running a pipeline that we've created before. And I'm going to go ahead and deploy the latest version of the application. And I'm going to just call it Orasi, some exclamation marks. Send notifications only to me to make sure I don't blast my colleagues here. And click submit. And so this is what we're going through when we're going through our deployment. If you remember going back to the multiple stages that we've outlined here, a lot of times with a particular deployment, right, to get items right, to say, hey, you know what, we're applying a different rule set to development, applying a different, let's say, level of rigor. So we've, as we're going on to deploy, kind of walk through what this does here. So we're actually picked a very quick way to deploy. We're doing a rolling deployment here, which is successful. And basically making sure that, hey, all of the particular confident building stuff's pretty lightweight. So we're also creating a Jira for change management, right? So we're taking track of what we have to do. Also, going back to that code level or dev-centric scanning, running a sonar cube scan here, make sure I get a passing score of my artifact here. And then as this, this is designed to make sure that, hey, we're allowing folks to get to at least to the next stage without hindering them. I'll actually go ahead and approve this Jira really quickly because it takes a second to synchronize. One of the hardest things, it's usually an all or nothing approach, right? You either automate everything or automate nothing. The irony of automating everything but the button push is actually very hard. But in Harness, we're able to do that. So going back to, hey, maybe your change management policy requires you to have a Jira or a ServiceNow ticket or some sort of ticket to kind of track the life cycle of the deployment through. We're actually able to create that automatically on the fly here. So I'm going to go ahead and approve this ticket and then kind of explain the QA and prod stages as this goes about. So I'm not sure if you can see that. So it looks like I changed tabs, but I'm just approving the ServiceNow ticket. So back to the particular tab here. And so it's funny that all of these particular Jira tickets go to our CTO. So he knows every time we run a demo, but I just switched over to Jira and approved the ticket. So taking a look at as we go across multiple stages here, when we're in the QA particular stage, we're actually increasing the amount of rigor, right? So we're doing more checks. So going back to tightening the rope type of model. Here we're running Selenium tests. We're running JMeter tests. And we're also running a regression set of tests, right, that we have here. And so the reason why we do this is that as we're going closer and closer to production, we're actually making sure that we have the ability to ratchet up the rule set that we do have. And so, well, actually, this workflow is actually designed to fail. So I'll actually, when the webhook syncs from our Jira instance to the Harness platform here, it should kick off for us in any second. When we're deploying to prod, some of the rule sets that we apply are the most stringent rule sets. So there we go. Looks like the ticket automatically got approved. And so we're going to be going to prod here. And this is where we're introducing a canary workflow, right? So if you're not familiar with what a canary is, so I mentioned it a little bit before, a canary deployment is an incremental deployment. So going back to the canary in the coal mine stage, or the canary in the coal mine days, you send a little canary down, and then you keep moving the canary closer and closer to the end of the mine to make sure the canary doesn't pass away. Similar approach you can do in your deployments. It's a release mechanism that, hey, you might deploy, if you're going from version 1 to 1.1 of an application, version 1.1 might be the canary release, version 1 is stable. And so you kind of increment thing. If you had 100 nodes, you introduce 20% or 20 nodes as a canary, and then you have 80. If this pass test, you kind of increment the canary here. We went from a 20/80 to an 80/20, being stable release or being canary versus stable release, and then vice versa. One of the hardest things to actually do, though, if you're taking a look at, hey, you know what, going back to normalcy, how do we know when do we stop? How do we know that what we had didn't work? In this particular stage, when we're looking to promote the canary, the beauty of the Harness platform, we have a feature called continuous verification. So going back to the credit scoring analogy, we're able to pull in from tools that you actually have or that you are looking to acquire, like such as AppDynamics, Dynatrace, New Relic, and we're able to ascertain data from these tools saying, hey, you know what, compared to your last deployment, something is off, right? So you have some sort of regression here. Based on what AppDynamics is saying, this is not, by convention, this regression means that you shouldn't move forward, so we'd roll the canary back. Similarly, if you have logs, right, so what the Harness platform actually does, it mimics what your engineers would actually do. So let's say that Richard and I were on the same team, and like Richard was a lead engineer, and I'm a staff engineer, and when we're going to deploy something, Richard in his head might have all the knowledge, like, oh, you know what, every fifth line of log is a warning. I've worked on projects like that before that I have no idea why the application came up or got deployed. But you're basically tailing and gripping the logs, right, and using tribal knowledge to understand that, oh, is what I'm deploying makes sense. And that knowledge is really hard to get. The Harness platform, again, going back to the credit score analogy, is able to flag things that weren't there before that look anomalous. Also, tune out some of the noise. So going back to, hey, we know that every fifth line of the log is a warning, it's not a problem. We would kind of mark that as, hey, this is expected. And then events that are info or that are not, so severe we pass along. But basically, we're making a judgment call decision on your behalf, saying, that didn't look right, that looks okay. And then by convention, rolling back this particular canary. So getting this type of data is actually quite difficult and without the Harness platform. So I kind of leave it with, if you had no experience in how to build a pipeline, this particular pipeline, with the caveat that you had the ability to have credentials to everywhere that this pipeline touched, you can build something like this in about a half an hour. It doesn't actually take that long to build something like this. And so what we can actually show that, hey, don't take my word for it that, this is kind of, it's easier than you think, given if you had access to go about. We can take a look at some of our particular customer examples that we have, right? So looking to achieve ROI in your continuous delivery solution can be difficult, right? If you have to have that build versus buy analogy, it can take you a long time to build something like this. And I can talk through really quickly a few customer use cases that we have here. And so as you see on the screen here, we have I just highlighted a few customers that we have. We have a trio of customers that are public references, DataStax, Nutanix, and Line Data. And we have many more customers that are public, but I like these three particular firms. They kind of represent, if you're familiar with Nutanix or DataStax or Line Data, they're pretty forward-thinking engineering institutions, right? Like, hey, they certainly have engineering staff, especially, DataStax, they're the vendor behind Cassandra, right? So they're all about their DataStax cloud. They have a lot of engineering staff. So think of Nutanix, they're making the serverless data center. And so some of the benefits that, they saw pretty much almost right away, and when they started using the tool, was in ways of measuring deployment times, right? So Nutanix had a 93% reduction in deployment time, which is incredible, right? So you're almost cutting it, more than half, right? Or more than, doubling your speed there. Especially with DataStax, one of the things that they kind of pointed out was the amount of engineering toll. So if we kind of take a quick look, I'll reshare the screen really quickly. So if we kind of take a quick look at, the amount of firepower it would take you to wire this together, the amount of firepower it would take you to go about and having each team create something like this without a particular engine like Harness, it would take forever. And what DataStax is noticing, hey, that was taking a lot of engineering hours. And so by leveraging a tool like Harness and potentially partnering with a firm like Orasi, right? Hey, able to come in, able to take a look at your complete landscape, and implement the change that is needed throughout your organization to accomplish a task like this. But I will let Richard talk about that a little bit more. How Orasi puts the pieces together.
Sure, thanks, Robbie. So obviously we've done a lot of DevOps delivery projects, and this is just one example. As you mentioned, 93% gain. This was one we did where it was actually taking the client over a week, 8 days to go from source code check-in to being able to actually run through their entire environment, recompile everything, and deliver the application code. We were able to take, amazingly, over 98% of the waste out of that project. They would typically literally have 10 to 15 engineers on phone calls for long parts of days to make sure that they had all the people responsible for getting this thing promoted. So literally it was $40,000 to $60,000 a week in engineering costs. So at the beginning, it was taking them over a week. We were able to net that down to a couple of hours for them, basically in a fully automated way to go from A to Z. But I think the biggest thing from our perspective is we understand the use of tools like Harness, but it's the pulling all the pieces together. It's the infrastructure. It's everything from your agile cycles up front to what happens when I actually am going through a bunch of different tests. A lot of organizations, their QA function really hasn't caught up to the CI/CD world and really hasn't started to take on a lot of those API tests and really the newer kinds of tests that can be dropped into a continuous delivery process. And so we were able to help them and really achieve just crazy, improvements. And then you look back and you're like, I don't know how I could have ever lived in that old world. And so that's just an example. Obviously, the Harness folks, with so many of the tools and every one of those, the business cases there, pretty easy to see how you're going to get the improvements and sort of justify those changes. Robbie?
Thanks, Richard. So going back to some of the more difficult tasks, right? So let's have a little more of an intrinsic talk, and kind of take all the product out of it. Imagine yourself, you can just change projects, right, or change teams. A lot of software engineering. We strive to build things towards standards. We strive to build things towards design paradigms, and we strive to build things with industry standard practices and approaches. But the culmination of all of our hard work is our applications, right? And every application is different. It's a sum total of engineering effort before you, sum total of all your effort when you're on the project, and ironically, sum total of your, the people who come after you, right? And so knowing what normalcy is, it's probably one of the hardest things to learn. It's one of the hardest things to share. If you look at, there's a DevOps metrics called CAMS, Culture, Automation, Measurement, and Sharing. Sharing is actually the hardest one that people, kind of strive towards, right? And knowing your baseline, a lot of it is just where it comes into the return on investment, is reducing the amount of time that people take to onboard applications, and also reducing the amount of time your engineers have to become effective understanding what's normal. Let's say I was given a task that, hey, I need to write a feature and deploy it. Sure, that's, you get into a lengthy argument about where does the development responsibility versus platform engineering versus operations responsibility is, but let's say the developer owns that responsibility. Understanding, hey, let's say going back to the same paradigm that we're developing, that Richard and I are on the same team, I don't know anything about the application other than outside my machine, right? It's like, oh, this is a big unknown to me when I go to deploy, and it's actually pretty scary. If you haven't deployed before, it's fairly scary. I must have deployed hundreds of times in my career, and it gets a little easier, but still, your confidence is always like, oh boy, what did we do? And with the Harness platform, going back to, if you remember, looking at the dynamics metrics or the eye charts from the particular Elk or Splunk metrics, hey, we're able to capture what baselining is, what normalcy is for the application, which is huge. That's probably my favorite feature of the Harness platform, is helping address a problem that, hey, when people change with the institutional knowledge of what's normal for your application. And a lot of that has to do with maybe organization or organizational skills, right? And so going back to, we always spend so much time on a particular project, is that, we always have to hand our work off to somebody. If you take a look at usually who the primary buyer or the primary purchaser usually of a Harness platform is, usually that's a platform engineering team, a dev tools team, or even your DevOps team, right? Not saying that other people can't buy the product, but that's typically who we talk to. They're always faced with this problem that as a leveraged team, right, so development tools, the engineering efficiency, platform engineering, leveraged teams, they're fighting this problem, that uneasy feeling you have as an engineer when you go to a team and you have to deploy for the first time. They're basically the ones doing this 40 hours a week, every week. It's their job to deal with multiple applications and multiple teams. And so this becomes a real challenge, right? How do they know what normalcy is for all applications? Because again, the argument is every application is different. And so those teams are always tasked with coming up with the very creative and very, let's say, hard to produce baselines and metrics, and coming up with tooling that kind of helps them baseline them for themselves. And that's basically it, right? Finding that organizational structure can be hard. I always like this meme here. I'm not sure if I wrote confusing code or my coworkers are constantly or frequently confused. As an engineer, I see that funny. But for other folks whose job it is, that if you have the luxury of having a deployment or release team, or having a team that monitors, or platform engineering teams, it can be very difficult, right? And so kind of in closing, what, kind of the forward benefits of a CD as a service or a Harness platform is that you really don't have to manage the platform, right? And so hey, your job is hard enough to move the needle forward. Your job is hard enough to come up with the features. The last thing you want to do, is managing a platform that's supposed to have engineering efficiency. The irony of engineering efficiency platforms is that sometimes they're pretty heavy to actually maintain. Developer tooling or DevOps tooling can be notoriously complex because you're serving your internal customers or software engineers. And so don't let the big tangling, this poor fella here with all these network cables, but using a software as a service solution like Harness, hey, don't fight managing the platform. You should focus on the goodness. Don't focus on the hardships. It looks like we have a few questions coming up. Kind of our last slide here that we do have. Really a partnership between Orasi and Harness. Really are better together. Richard, I'm not sure if you have any closing remarks before we kind of take a look at the questions.
No, I think that's it. We have a couple of questions. I don't know how many we'll be able to get to before we get sort of ended here. One of the first questions that I see, Ravi, this might be more for you, is there are tools in the market like Spinnaker, which are open source based. Why would I pay for a tool like Harness when I can get those other kind of products for no cost?
Yeah, so usually a build versus buy argument is a complicated argument, right? So it takes a lot of decision points and factor points. It can be any tool. Like, do I build it? Do I buy it? With a tool like Spinnaker, Spinnaker, it's pretty opinionated and unopinionated at the same time. So opinionation of Spinnaker comes into where you deploy, right? You have to be using an AMI. You have to be going to a compliant Kubernetes cluster. One of the things we didn't talk about, kind of product fit for Harness, is that we're kind of unopinionated where you deploy. You can deploy to bare metal, you can deploy to Kubernetes, you can deploy to ECS, you can deploy to AMIs, you can deploy to serverless, to Lambdas. The Harness platform is ubiquitous where you can deploy. It is opinionated how you deploy. Okay, if you do this step, you must do step 2. To have a canary, you must figure out how to promote or do a judgment call. So not sure who asked that question, but it's a very detailed conversation also about skill set, right? Like do you want to maintain and leverage a tool? There's no such thing as a free lunch, but it is a really great tool. Let's get just 2 other questions here. There's one about, I'll read the other one. We use Jenkins to build and orchestrate our CI pipeline and using it for some of our CD work. Will I be able to keep my investment in that tool set while building new capabilities around Harness? What advantages would Harness provide me over Jenkins? People ask very detailed questions on this webinar. Yeah, very, very detailed listeners here. So
you'll have to be a quick answer there.
I know. It like the other question, it is more of a discussion type of question, right? Like Jenkins, if you take a look at the history of the project, it came from Hudson, right? So it ushered in CI to the masses. It's internally at Harness, we use Jenkins X to build our stuff, right? Where you kind of start seeing complication, like, when using Jenkins or other CI tool, is that you have a very heavy scripting portion of it. The build is automated for sure. Like, hey, Jenkins or other CI tools are calling build and deploy tools for you on your behalf. But when you start getting into the confidence building steps, it gets complicated. Like, what do you do during a failure? Like, how do you get approval? How do you orchestrate? Either it's the poor release DevOps engineer, kind of orchestrating all that, or you're dealing in thousands of lines of Jenkins files, which is hard to debug and hard to someone to learn. It reminds me of very asymmetric programming before. So from they really are better together, right? Like we have most of our customers call a CI tool directly from Harness, and we orchestrate the build portion, and we also orchestrate kind of the confidence building steps. Yep. So it looks like someone
Robbie,
had
I'm gonna wrap it up. We'll jump past the last question because I know we're running out. We're over on time. I really appreciate you joining. I really appreciate Harness joining us and all the information you guys have shared. And I want to thank everybody else for joining us on this webinar. And be safe. And if there's anything that we can answer for you, please feel free to contact us at www.orasi.com. You can contact me directly, richard.white, W-H-I-T-E, at orasi.com. or visit Harness at harness.io. So again, thank you, Ravi, and we'll wrap up now. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.